Good afternoon, everyone. If you could please begin to take your seats. We'll go ahead and start the event shortly. My name is Dr. Mohammed Gamrawi. I am the Senior Program Coordinator for the Mohsen and Fawzia Jaffer Center for Muslim World Studies. And on behalf of the Jaffer Center, I'd like to welcome you all to today's lecture. Today's lecture is titled Before and Beyond the Earthquake, Turkey and its Domestic and External Challenges. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Gönül Tol. She is the founding director of the Middle East Institute's Turkey program and a senior fellow for the Frontier Europe Initiative. She is also the author of the recent book, Erdoğan's War, A Strongman's Struggle at Home and in Syria, published by Oxford in 2023. With that, I'd like to also, before we begin, to thank our co-sponsors, the Dorothea Green Lecture Series, as well as the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Distinguished Lecture Series, and the Department of Politics and International Relations. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It is my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Gönül Tol.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Well, thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, Dr. Mezbahi and FIU for inviting me. It's really great to be back. I'm just sorry that it happened at a very unfortunate time in Turkey. To those who might have friends, family members in Turkey affected by the earthquake, my sincere condolences. I want to start, I've been to a lot of book talks, and one of the questions that people often get is, why did you write this book? Why did you write about this topic? So I want to start with that and later talk about what's inside the book. It was around late 2011. I've been living in Washington, D.C. for many years now. So in 2011, I was sitting at my office and we were hosting a group from the State Department. And at the time, I was writing a lot about Turkish domestic politics. And if you remember 2011, late 2011, the Arab uprisings had erupted, and Turkey became one of the most active actors in the region. Turkish president, prime minister at the time, he threw his support behind the popular movements. He completely changed his previously very cautious foreign policy. And I was writing a lot about Turkish domestic politics instead of Turkey's regional policy. So one of the people in the group working for the State Department said, in a very nice way, trying very hard not to offend me, he said, Gönül, you know, a lot is happening in the region, and you are one of the very few programs in town who constantly write about Turkish domestic politics. So do you get a lot of feedback on that? So he was just curious whether I was wasting my time covering Turkish domestic politics at a time when in his mind I should be writing and covering more about what Turkey was doing on the foreign policy front. So that was when I decided to write this book. And the book, the main argument of the book is that you cannot understand what Turkish president or Turkey is doing on the foreign policy front without understanding what's happening inside the country, without understanding what his domestic agenda is. Because for President Erdoğan, foreign policy has always been first and foremost about his efforts to consolidate his rule. So Erdoğan came to power in 2002. I don't know how closely you follow Turkey, but President Erdoğan comes from an Islamist rooted background. He was previously part of an Islamist party, but when he came to power in 2002, he said that he was a different man, that he was not an Islamist anymore. And he defined himself and his newly established party as a conservative democratic party. And people like me, I consider myself pretty liberal, and I usually would not vote for an Islamist-rooted politician, voted for him. So his party appealed to a much larger constituency than the traditional conservative constituency his previous party had. And why was that? Because he framed his party and himself as a party that prioritized country's democratization. He talked a lot about how Turkey struggled with granting rights to its minorities, like the Kurds, and he campaigned on the promise that Turkey would become a member of the European Union. And he also promised that he would curb the military's power in Turkish politics. So those were all music to our ears. But we weren't just naive. We didn't just take his word for it. He made Turkey's EU membership as his #1 domestic and foreign policy priority. And he pushed really hard for Turkey to become a member. And he did something else on the foreign policy front. Because he came from an Islamist-rooted background, many people were, of course, skeptical, thinking that, okay, here we have a leader who is an Islamist in disguise, and he's going to do everything in his power to Islamicize the country's foreign policy. Now, what does that look like? What does an Islamist foreign policy look like? In their minds, in the minds of the secularists, he would probably cultivate very close ties to countries like Iran, to countries like Syria. He would probably refer to the country's common Islamic and Ottoman past. So that was the expectation. But that's not what Erdoğan did. He cultivated ties with regional leaders only after Turkey's EU membership process failed. And when he finally cultivated those close ties with Muslim countries, he did so in a very pragmatic way. He did not refer to the common Islamic past, the common Ottoman past. Instead, he said, I'm using trade and investment as the backbone of my policy. So this is a pretty pragmatic policy. So what those things, those two main moves on the foreign policy front do for Erdoğan? It helped him convince people like me who were previously skeptical that in fact he was a new man, that he was not an Islamist anymore. So he used foreign policy to consolidate his identity, political identity, as a conservative Democrat. And I'm talking about the early years. So from the get-go, foreign policy was never about international pushes and pulls for Erdoğan. He used foreign policy to do several things. First, to construct an identity for himself and for his party. And second, he used foreign policy to weaken and divide his opponents. So up until 2011, when he pushed for a pro-EU, pro-Western, and a very pragmatic Middle East policy, he used Turkey's EU membership process to weaken his secularist opponents, and chief among them was the military. So by carrying out reforms that were required by the EU membership, he made sure the military's political power was curbed. So in many ways, it was a brilliant strategy, right? Because he framed himself as a reformer. But in the meantime, step by step, he consolidated his power. So he marginalized the secularist establishment, and later on, he took steps that brought everything else under his control: the judiciary, media, business groups, and all bureaucratic institutions. So by 2011, and that was when the Arab uprisings erupted, late 2010 and 2011. So by 2011, Erdoğan had already consolidated power, all power in his own hands. So now, that whole, I'm a conservative Democrat, I'm a pro-EU guy, and I pursue a very pragmatic policy in the region. What does pursuing a pragmatic policy in the region meant? He did not care about internal affairs of these countries. He didn't care about establishing democratic states there. He cultivated close ties with the region's autocrats. He did business with them. So it was pragmatic, no ideology involved. But by 2011, that whole strategy changed. And along with his foreign policy. Why? Because his domestic strategy to stay in power changed. His first goal when he first came to power was curbing the secularists' influence. And by 2011, he had achieved that. So now he set his eyes on a new goal, which was switching the country's parliamentary system to a presidential system with little checks and balances. Now, he could not do that with the conservative democratic brand, right? Like people like me were already been alienated because he had given up on the liberal agenda or democratic consolidation agenda. He had given up on the EU promise. It wasn't all his fault. I think it also it was the EU's fault as well. But so he had a completely different agenda now. And to switch to a presidential system, and that was practically, that meant establishing his personalist rule, one-man rule, he could not mobilize his previous allies, liberals, social democrats. It was very difficult for him to work with the previous allies to realize that goal. So he needed new allies starting from 2011. And those new allies became clear shortly after his election victory in 2011. So he wanted to rely on two different segments of the country, the Kurds and the conservative segments of the country, to make sure that he can establish a presidential system. So what did that mean at the domestic front? That meant he embarked on a process of Islamization. And when I talk about Islamization at home, I'm not talking about establishing a theocracy or anything. I'm talking about, in Turkish standards, he injected a lot of religion into the public sphere and the country's education system. And that was his way of appealing to the country's conservative segments. When it comes to the Kurds, to appeal to them, he launched several Kurdish openings that were meant to grant more rights to the Kurds, and that was all to make sure to mobilize them behind his presidential dream. So that was his domestic agenda at the time. And the Arab uprisings came at the perfect moment for him, because the Arab uprisings allowed Erdoğan to expand that Islamization agenda beyond Turkey's borders. He framed the uprisings as the Arabs' own struggle to get rid of their own, what he called, godless, elitist regimes. That was how he framed the Arab uprisings. And some of his ministers said Arabs are getting rid of their own Kemalists. Kemalist is the secularist founding ideology. So that's how he framed. So that the Arab uprisings allowed him to burnish his Islamist credentials. And that's why very early on, right after the uprising started, Turkey started supporting groups like Muslim Brotherhood, for instance. Especially particularly significant was what he did in Syria. So in my book, I talk a lot about Erdoğan's policy in Syria. And when I was doing research for the book, I had the opportunity to talk to a lot of people on the ground, some who had worked very closely with President Erdoğan at the time, including the former Turkish President Abdullah Gül. So I asked him a question, for instance. I said, so the uprising in Syria started in March 2011, and only shortly after that, Turkey started sending weapons to the Syrian opposition. So what's your take on that? And he said that he had warned them at the time not to do that, saying we share a long border, so if you arm groups, and you don't know them very well, if you arm groups there, that's really going to destabilize our own country, but they didn't listen. So, but Erdoğan's main motivation was, again, to burnish his Islamist credentials at home. And it again worked brilliantly, because at the time, what Erdoğan was doing in Syria early on, backing the popular uprising, trying to topple the Assad regime, it was very popular in the first few years of the uprising. But his policy of relying on Islamist and conservative segments of the country failed. And we know that in 2015, Turkey held elections, and Erdoğan's party, for the first time since it came to power, lost its parliamentary majority, largely thanks to the Kurds, the pro-Kurdish party, capturing a historic 13%, and that denied his party the majority. So his plan to rely on those segments of the country to switch to a presidential system failed, right? So he had to switch tactics, and he did. In 2015, he allied himself with the Turkish nationalists. So that domestic alliance translated into a completely different Syria policy. Before 2015, when Erdoğan was still framing himself as the hope of the Muslim nation, as the protector of Muslims across the world, that was his narrative. From 2015 onwards, after he allied himself with the nationalists, his priorities in Syria changed. This time, his priority was not toppling the Assad regime, but it was curbing the influence of the Kurds there. Turkey has a large Kurdish minority, and they have been waging a struggle, waging a war against the Turkish state since 1980s, because they are pursuing greater rights. So the question of Kurdish identity in Turkey is very problematic, especially for the Turkish nationalists. For many years, the official line was, we don't have Kurds. We don't have a Kurdish minority. They're just mountain Turks. They just don't know it. That was the official line. And Erdoğan, as part of this process of Islamization at home, he had an opening with the Kurds. But again, when that strategy failed, he changed tactics. So now in Syria, his number one goal was to make sure that Kurdish power in that country, in Syria, is curbed. So toppling the Assad regime took a backseat to that goal. And that his alliance with the nationalists did wonders for Erdoğan. He won election after election because of that nationalist alliance. He managed to switch the country's parliamentary system to a presidential system. He managed to win the elections. And he centralized power in his hands even further. But in 2019, something else happened that forced Erdoğan to change tactics again. And that was in 2019, Turkey held municipal elections. And Erdoğan's party lost almost all major cities. And you might think, what's the big deal? It's just municipal elections. But municipalities holding control of municipalities is very important for Erdoğan because those big municipalities have really been key to feeding the clientelistic network that he has found since he came to power. Istanbul, for instance, is the country's financial capital, has large resources, and other cities, other municipalities too. So those resources came in very handy for Erdoğan in his 2 decades in power. So losing those resources dealt a huge blow to his rule. And the number 2 reason for his election loss was the presence of millions of Syrian refugees in Turkey. Now Turkey hosts around more than 4 million Syrian refugees. And now there is a growing nationalist backlash against the refugees. So in 2019, that's what the polls tell us, the top reason for Erdoğan's election loss was the economic problems, but the number 2 reason was the Syrian refugees. So Erdoğan thought that he had to pay attention, that he had to provide a solution to the Syrian refugee question to be able to stay in power. So that's when he once again switched priorities in Syria. So again, from 2011 to 2015, number 1 goal, Turkey's goal in Syria was toppling the regime, Assad regime. From 2015 to 2019, number 1 goal was curbing Kurdish influence. And from 2019 onwards, he now has a different priority. And what is that priority? He is trying to establish a long and deep enough zone inside Syria so he can send back the Syrian refugees. It's not legal. You cannot force people to go back to a war zone. It's not practical. It's probably never going to happen, but it doesn't matter. Erdoğan is now pitching his plan as the most viable solution, and many people might be buying that. So going back to my original point, there must be IR students among you. We always, when I was a student too, we always pay attention to the balance of power, to the international environment. Yes, we do pay some attention to what those leaders on the international stage are trying to do at home, but I think we don't pay enough attention to how countries like Turkey, where strongman rule, right? Turkey has become a personalist autocracy. We don't pay enough attention to how these strongmen, from Putin to Chavez to Modi to others, to Erdoğan, how these men use foreign policy to consolidate their personalist autocracy. And that's the whole point of the book. And that's why I devoted 3 chapters to domestic politics. I remember one of our board members picked up the book and said, well, there's Syria on the title. Well, you don't see it here, but the title is Erdoğan's War, a strongman's struggle at home and in Syria. And he said, well, it took 3 chapters for me to get to Syria. He was frustrated, and I said, that's the whole point. To understand what he's doing in Syria, you have to be paying attention to what he's trying to do at home. So that's the whole point. That's why I wrote the book. I think there is now, I told you about the main breaking points, turning points in the country's politics under Erdoğan. I think we might be going through another turning point with the earthquake. So I was there during the earthquake. My sister lives in the epicenter of the earthquake, but thank God she was with me that day with her 4-year-old daughter, only because after a meeting I wanted to stop by my hometown, which is only a 2-hour drive from where the earthquake happened. I wanted to go there and spend the day with my sister and with my parents, and that's why she was with me. But we drove to the earthquake zone, and it was really heartbreaking. It was like a war zone, as if someone dropped a bomb. There were dead bodies on the streets, people screaming, trying to get help. And my sister's own family, her husband's parents were trapped under the rubble. We tried to pull him out. We pulled him out of the rubble, but there was a large concrete block. His legs were stuck under that block. And we couldn't. We needed tools. We didn't have tools. It was cold. It was raining. No electricity, nothing. So we waited and waited and waited. We waited for 48 hours, holding his hand, telling him that help was on the way, and it never came. And the reason why I'm telling you this, not because I want you to cry, but I want you to understand something that has a larger theoretical argument, I think. Erdoğan came to power promising stability. He came to power after another deadly earthquake that struck the country in 1999. And at the time, I was a college student in Ankara. And we rushed to the earthquake zone. I was part of this student organization. We mobilized our very little resources. We went there to distribute aid, food and water to the victims. And when we got there, which was pretty quickly, shortly after the earthquake hit, we saw Turkish NGOs there working on the ground. We saw Turkish Rescue Agency. We saw Turkish troops deployed. Turkey has NATO's second biggest army. I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of troops. And they are in any country, here too, in any country, military is the most disciplined, most organized organization, right? So, and they search and rescue operations and response to disasters like this is part of their mission. So in 1999, when I went there less than 24 hours later, I saw all those institutions and groups working on the ground. Not this time. This time we waited for 48 hours. So to write a piece, I talked to a retired military guy from Turkey, and I asked him, how do you explain why weren't Turkish troops there? It would have made such a huge difference. My family members died because there was no one to help, and all we needed was a simple tool. We had already dug him out, but there was no one there. And he said, you know what? 15 minutes after the earthquake hit, all Turkish troops stood ready to intervene. We were all waiting for orders from the president, and that order never came in the critical 48 hours. So the rescue agency, it's called AFAD in Turkish, it wasn't there either. What happened there? It wasn't there. It's the same reason. The military wasn't there, AFAD wasn't there, Turkish civil society wasn't there. Because Erdoğan, in his 20 years in power, he hollowed out institutions. He weakened them to the point that the state, it really eroded his ability to govern. So these institutions, they've become so weakened that they couldn't mobilize. And everyone was looking at Ankara. Everyone was looking for orders from one man. No one could take the initiative because they didn't want to be... I was talking to this journalist who was talking to the governor of Hatay, that's where my sister lives. So governors usually, legally, they can call for troops. They can ask troops to be deployed. It's legal for them to do so. But none of them wanted to do that because they didn't want to upset Erdoğan. So do you understand what I'm trying to see here? So strongmen, they centralize power to become strongmen, right? That's what they have to do. But in doing so, they erode the very institutions that are important to govern. So paradoxically, while they are centralizing power, they are weakening themselves. So that's why I think this is a turning point. Because everyone there, yes, Erdoğan controls all media, but 10 provinces were hit. Everyone that I know, even if he shifts the narrative, controls the narrative the way he wants because he controls the media, it's not possible for him to hide what's going on there because the area that's been affected is so huge. 10 provinces have been hit. Everyone that I know knows someone whose family member, whose friend died, who lost a house in the earthquake. So one of the things that I heard the most when I was in the earthquake zone was, where is the state? Where is where's Turkish military? Where are the NGOs? Where are the rescue agencies? They are not there because they do not have the capacity. They cannot act, they cannot initiate anything because the system is so centralized that they constantly have to get the green light from the president. This main rescue agency, for instance, Turkey is an earthquake zone. It sits on two huge fault lines. That means you need a huge bureaucracy, a very strong agency with a big budget and a big personnel, huge staff. Afad, on the other hand, its budget is much smaller than the budget of Directorate for Religious Affairs. It only has, Turkey is 85 million, population is 85 million. Afad has 7,000 people on its staff, and the person who is in charge is the graduate of a faculty of theology. And no offense to graduates of faculty of theology, but if you are in charge of a search and rescue agency, you have to have the credentials, right? You have to have some kind of experience. Many of these men didn't. So this just tells you the decay in the institutional structure, and this is not a unique story to Turkey. This is the story of Strongman. I recently read an excellent book. The title is Weak Strongman. So that's what we're seeing today, and I think Erdoğan will pay a political price for that. And that's why I believe the recent earthquake, is going to be a turning point because one man tries to calls all the shots in a country as big as Turkey, and apparently he cannot. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Yes, sir.
Comparing Erdoğan to Trump and Bolsonaro, do you think, based on your experience research, that he would accept a defeat in an election?
That's a great question, and thanks for asking that. I get that question a lot. And in fact, when I was in Turkey this time around, I asked a man who used to be Erdoğan's close aide. Just asked him, I said, do you think he will just walk away? Imagine a scenario where he loses the elections. Is he just going to say, fine, yeah, I lost. Is he going to walk away? And he said, and I also asked the Bolsonaro question. You know, Bolsonaro is in Florida, I guess, still, right? So will he flee the country? And he said, no, because Erdoğan still has a large following. Despite the many problems the country has, its support is somewhere. I haven't seen the new figures, by the way, after the earthquake, but still 35 to 40% of the population still supports Erdoğan. Whether he's going to accept the elections, well, looking at his track record, I want to be cautious there, because in 2015 he lost the elections. In June 2015, his party lost the parliamentary majority. He just didn't accept the results. He called for a rerun. And in 2019, after the municipal elections, He lost Istanbul, and Istanbul is a huge deal for Erdoğan. That's where he launched his political career. That's where it's very important for him emotionally as well. So he didn't accept the election results there, and he called for a rerun. And he lost by even a bigger margin in the rerun. So, so I cannot confidently say, of course, he will accept the election results. But this is what I can say. Having talked to opposition parties and having seen what they have been doing to protect the ballot box, I think it's going to be very difficult for him not to accept the election results if he loses by a 3-4 point margin. If the margin is not wide enough, there is always the possibility that he could rig the elections, that he will not accept the results. But if that margin is wide enough, I think the opposition parties are strong enough to make him accept the results. In 2019, for instance, a lot of us, I mean, myself included, I had resigned myself to the fact that, you know, elections will not matter anymore. This was before 2019 elections. You know, elections won't matter. He's going to rig. He did that in 2015. He did that in 2017 in the referendum. So I'm not holding my breath. That's where I was before the municipal elections. But then came the election results. He lost. And he could only call for a rerun in Istanbul, not in other places. So which makes me think that he will have to accept the results if the opposition wins, if the margin is I think, wide enough.
But he arrested the mayor of Istanbul, right?
He tried. It hasn't worked.
Oh. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So you talked about how the military has been eroded, also how Erdoğan has not authorized the military, he's not initially. Do you think that is any way connected to the events of 2016, where some elements of the military tried to overthrow him?
Sure. I mean, look, there are several things. My initial theory was he didn't want to, he didn't deploy the troops mainly because he didn't want the military to outshine him. Because everyone there on the ground were criticizing Erdoğan. He wasn't there. He himself showed up at the earthquake zone 3 days later. And his coalition partner, Blinken, toured the region before his coalition partner, who visited the earthquake zone 2 weeks after. So my initial theory was that having survived a coup attempt, he probably did not want to see that picture where military is seen by the people as heroes, pulling people out of the rubble, saving lives. But I could be wrong. Now that I think about it, there could be another explanation, and that is this could be a simple turf war, where Afat was created by Erdoğan, and it was created by Erdoğan to take away the military's role in response to disasters, right? So it's become his small little agency where he stuffed his loyalists there, and he uses Afat to showcase that, you know, we don't need military to be doing these things. We have this perfect little agency that is doing even a better job. So maybe in the initial hours, because you know, one bad thing, another bad thing about strongmen is they are very isolated. And the flow of information can be very restricted because no one wants to be the one who gives bad news to the strongman, right? So maybe Afat, just after the earthquake hit, the head of Afat went to Erdoğan and said, "Sir, everything is under control. No need to deploy troops. We can take care of this. We can handle this." And he waited for hours and hours. So that's another explanation.
In recent months leading up to the earthquake, Erdoğan has taken an increasingly aggressive position towards his neighbors, specifically with Greece and with Syria and Iraqi Kurdistan. And it was seen as he might take up a military operation specifically against the Kurds to curry more favor before the upcoming elections. Do you think this earthquake may force him into doing that as a desperate attempt to rescue his re-election bid?
That's another. You guys ask great questions. A great question. I think right now he's too preoccupied with what's going on in the country. I agree with you. Before the earthquake, we were all discussing whether or when he was going to launch another incursion into Syria. Because again, going back to my point about his priorities right now, he wanted to launch this incursion into Syria to make the case that he's going to solve the refugee problem, right? Because he frames this incursion as a way to create a zone inside Syria. So I was pretty sure that he was gonna that operation was gonna happen, and he was gonna shake hands with Assad. But right now, elections are scheduled to take place in May. That's going to be logistically very difficult. According to the Constitution, he cannot hold the elections later than June. So let's imagine a scenario where the elections are going to take place in June. So for him to be doing anything, launching another incursion into Syria is going to be very difficult, because people are now criticizing his slow response, saying that, well, if you didn't have that many Turkish troops in Syria, those troops could have been saving lives in Turkey. So that's why that really limits his room for maneuver. So I don't see that happening before the elections. Astrid and you.
Dr. Tol, very interesting. I have learned so much. I've taken so many notes. What you're describing reminds me of stories that have happened in Latin America before. Of course, things are different, but some things are similar. Earthquakes can be moments, political opportunities for the opposition to rise up, to gain more strength. And I have questions for you about the earthquake. The earthquake is a turning point. Do you have evidence how this is deteriorating the image of him as a corrupt leader, that he's misusing international aid, stealing international aid, using resources to punish communities that are part of the opposition? And that's one question. And the second question is, what can the opposition do to take momentum of this tragedy, to maybe gain more strength and probably win as more votes as they can for the May or June elections?
Well, about the first question, Erdoğan using aid money to advance his domestic agenda is a problem that we have to, our next problem. Right now, the biggest problem is that first search and rescue efforts failed. They were not there. The agencies that I mentioned, Afad was not there, and there's a lot of frustration, a lot of anger on the ground. And one more thing, all these, the 10 provinces that have been affected by the earthquake, out of those 10, 7 of them are run by ruling party, Erdoğan's party, municipalities. So this is a significant constituency for Erdoğan. Now, how is that going to translate? How is that going to be reflected in the election results? That's difficult to say, because from a logistical point of view, there's like more than 1 million homeless people. If you're going to hold the elections in a few months, how are you going to change their registration? How are you going to, I mean, just the practicality of things. How are those people, many of them are dead, unfortunately. So it's a major logistical burden, which means maybe it won't have a direct impact in that regard. But I think the rest of the country, I think, has seen what Erdoğan hasn't done in response. So I think that's the number one impact. But in terms of whether Erdoğan is going to use international financial aid, he might, but that's not something that we think about that right now. Initially, I think he entertained the idea of holding the elections a year from now. And a lot of people raised concern, saying that if he holds the elections a year from now, that's going to give him enough time and international financial resources to rebuild those cities. And that was his number one promise. He said, we're going to promise these cities, rebuild these cities in less than a year. Give me 1 year. That was his first initial reaction, as if all that construction wasn't responsible for what happened to those people. He's promising to do more. But so yes, there is a risk that that could happen. But I think here is Erdoğan's dilemma. On the one hand, holding elections immediately is risky for him because there's still going to be a lot of anger, right? But on the other hand, if you hold it a year from now, the earthquake already compounded the country's political and economic problems, and unfortunately the country is not going to be in a better place a year from now. And that's not going to be good for Erdoğan. So he has this dilemma. Down the line, one of the things I raised, for instance, right after that, US agencies asked scholars like me, we had a meeting, they were trying to figure out what kind of help they need to send, and one of the things that I said was, make sure the money you send doesn't go to the man whose actions paved the way for this tragedy. And several others made the same argument for Syria. A Syrian colleague said that, how do we make sure that the money doesn't empower the very man who is responsible for our misery? So that is a concern. But at this point, yeah, we don't think about that. Your question about the opposition, I think the opposition has done a great job. I was skeptical about the opposition's performance before the elections, because we're talking about a coalition of several parties with completely different ideological backgrounds. You have Turkish nationalists, you have Kurdish nationalists, you have secularists, you have Islamists. So it's like a huge umbrella coalition, and there are little parties underneath. So it's very difficult for them to have a united voice, a united agenda, and people are frustrated. We all thought that the opposition was not doing enough in channeling public frustration. They hadn't even fielded a candidate yet. So all these problems, we're all talking about that. Now no one is talking about those problems. Everyone is focused on Erdoğan's failure, and the opposition did a great job in terms of shaping the narrative accordingly. In previous disasters, the opposition did not really want to blame Erdoğan. Instead, they said, oh, this is a natural disaster. Let's not politicize this. Everything is political, but that wasn't the narrative. Let's not politicize this, line up behind Erdoğan. But this time, the main opposition party said, this is on you, Erdoğan. Because of your corrupt system, because of your corrupt cronies in the construction sector, because of everything that you have done and you haven't done, you're responsible for this. And other parties back that narrative. So that's number one. That means that the opposition is more united and saying the right things. And the second thing is they immediately mobilize their resources in the municipalities, the opposition parties. In some places, even before AFAD, government agency, people saw these opposition parties, trucks, rescue workers, tents. So I think that's going to have an impact too. So in that regard, I appreciate the opposition party's track record. So. Oh, sorry. Yes.
So you mentioned that he doesn't want the military to look like heroes, like during the events of the earthquake. Do you feel like he is in favor of the military? Do you feel like if he empowers the military presence within Turkey versus on borders, that the leaders of the military will empower him?
Well, remember in 2019 there was a coup attempt against Erdoğan. So I'm sure that's always in the back of his mind. But since then, he has done a lot in terms of, it was a difficult balance, because imagine you are NATO's second biggest army and Erdoğan has all these ambitions, right? Militarily, the country is so overstretched. We have military presence everywhere, in the Balkans, in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, in Africa, in other places. So on the one hand, you want the military to be strong enough to project power, but not too strong to overthrow you. So that was a major dilemma that he had. I don't know if he overcame that dilemma. I think, I mean, Turkish military, I think, still capable, but on the other hand, it's not like the military we had. It's very much politicized. In instances like this, for instance, again, I was talking to a retired military officer who said in 1999, we did not expect orders from anywhere when the earthquake hit. We were immediately on the ground. So some of the steps that Erdoğan took really eroded the military's capacity. So now the military has been weakened. It's certainly been brought under civilian control, which is important in a democracy, right? That's the right thing to do. But I think what he did has gone beyond that and weakened the military. And yet, I still think that he might be fearful of another coup. Many people say that the reason why he purchased the S-400 Russian missile defense system is because he is afraid he wants to be able to shoot down F-16s, right? And he cannot do that with Patriots, so he needs S-400s to shoot down F-16s. That means that he must be afraid of his own military. But that's just my theory. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the great talk. My questions are related to your previous answer. So, first, two questions. First, Erdoğan has been very successful in creating these moments that were imprinted in different stages of his political career on people's mind, like how he walked out on Netanyahu in Davos, or that famous FaceTime he had with CNN Turk, to that coup that happened a few years ago. Do you think with pursuing a policy of social welfare, he would be able to recreate such a moment that that is imprinted in Turkish people's mind for the coming election? And my second question would be, well, we spoke of how the opposition have responded, like İmamoğlu sending the municipality of Turkey's forces all the way to southern Turkey, but at the same time, the opposition leaders have not been able to circle around one person, right? İmamoğlu is barred apparently from running because of what he has said. Kılıçdaroğlu is someone who has already lost elections twice, 3 times before, and Akşener of E-Party is infamous for her remarks against the Kurds and her very ultra-nationalist narrative. So, is there really a person that the opposition can circle around, and we should not underestimate the cult of personality that Erdoğan has been able to create and recreate within the nation in the past 2 decades? Thank you.
Well, in terms of symbols, you're right. The symbols that you mentioned right after, on the day of the failed coup and the Davos incident and all that really helped Erdoğan develop that persona as first as a victim, but on the other hand, as someone who can stand up to everyone, a strong leader. Right now, the things that he did in response to the earthquake, in my opinion, creates a persona, paints a picture of someone who has zero empathy. He arrived, he was there in the earthquake zone 3 days after. Imagine, tens of thousands of your citizens died, and he just didn't care. He was not there. And when he finally got there, he threatened people. I wrote a short piece for Foreign Policy. If you ever find the time, take a look at it. And that's where I tell my family's personal story. As he was on national TV, calling those who criticized him for his slow response, He was calling those people dishonorable on national TV. At that very moment, my sister and her husband were pulling the dead bodies of their loved ones with their bare hands. There were still no one from the government. So that's a powerful symbol in the minds of many. If he went there immediately, I mean, he's a political mastermind, right? He can turn things around when you expect the least. He could have turned things around if he was there on the first day, and if he showed some compassion, if he said, I share your pain, we are in this together, I'm going to make sure everyone who is responsible for this will pay a price, and I'm asking all opposition parties to unite behind me. We'll all mourn as a nation. If he said those, he could, maybe. It's not a guarantee given the level of destruction, but I think he could have had a chance. Not anymore. It's very difficult for him to turn this around, especially given the fact that the elections are going to be held soon. Even now, he's constantly threatening people. He's jailed so many people, some of them are my friends. And all they said was, rescue agency, Afat was not here. I was there, it was not there. And yet he's calling me dishonorable. And remember what happened to Trump, right? I remember Trump, after Trump lost the elections, I talked to people in our neighborhood who had voted for Trump. And I asked, and these are all suburban women with children, young children, and I asked them what changed their mind, and they said, he showed no empathy during COVID. He didn't understand the pain, the anxiety we were going through. So empathy, in moments like this, that's what you want to see from your leader, and he didn't show any. So I think it's going to be difficult. Even the media under his control is not going to be able to spin it because, again, the area is so large, everyone in the rest of the country knows someone. Regarding the opposition, you're right. I mean, they couldn't come up with a candidate. I think, I'm not going to say which one should or shouldn't, but I think Kılıçdaroğlu is going to be the opposition coalition's candidate. And that's not a tragedy. I know he's not the most charismatic guy, but as I tweeted today, Turkey does not need a strong man, it needs strong institutions. Yeah, let the guy bore you to death as long as he delivers, as long as he restores confidence, a faith in institutions and democracy. And I think that's, he's capable of doing that. Yes.
So, you mentioned that a while back, Erdoğan attempted to join the European Union and it fell through. Do you think, well, my first question is, do you think that he would still be interested in pursuing that if the option came up? And my second question is that with the outbreak of the Ukrainian war, he found himself in a very advantageous position where he's one of the two countries left in NATO that is still vetoing Finland's membership and also organizing the grain passage through the strait from Ukraine. Do you think that he might try to leverage that influence to retry that attempt, or do you think that he moves on and not trust him?
Well, on the EU, it's not entirely Erdoğan's doing, actually. I mean, Erdoğan did many things to make sure Turkey gets into EU. It was the European countries' fault as well. In 2005, for instance, Germany and France talk about a privileged partnership instead of granting Turkey a full membership. So it's on them, I think. Erdoğan was ready to give many concessions, even on very critical issues like Cyprus, for instance. So I don't blame him there. Obviously, the direction that he has taken the country to an autocracy is now the big problem for Europeans too. But I am frustrated with the European Union as well because they do not have a principled stance anymore. They signed this refugee deal with Turkey. And now they see this as a very pragmatic relationship. You know, it's like as long as you keep the Syrian refugees in Turkey, you can do whatever you want. And that's not the EU that I used to believe in. So they stop pushing for a democracy agenda. Will things change? It might if the opposition wins the elections and if they try to put Turkish democracy back on track. I think there is a discussion to be made there. The European countries might be more willing, even especially after the Ukraine war. Because what Ukraine invasion did to European countries is it rekindled this debate about democracy versus autocracy, right? So it's not, yeah, you can be pragmatic, but then don't complain about it when an autocratic country invades one of the European countries in your backyard. So I think that's a relevant political context now, bringing that discussion. And I've seen more European politicians and scholars making the argument that we should do more to defend democracy. So in that context, I can easily see a rekindled relationship between European Union and a Turkey under opposition rule. To your question about Ukraine, will Erdoğan use that as an opportunity? He did, until he messed it up. Right after the Ukraine invasion, he did all the right things. He immediately called it a war. He invoked the Montreal Convention. He closed the Turkish straits to Russian ships. And he sent drones to Ukraine. And those were the things that really pleased a lot of people in the Congress. And the Congress is a place where there are not that many Erdoğan friends. But even those congressmen who were very critical of Erdoğan before the Ukraine invasion said, you know what, this guy is not that bad. He's doing all the right things. So there was a small window of opportunity that afforded Erdoğan this goodwill because of the things he's done. But that window closed right after he used Sweden and Finland's NATO accession as a trump card to get concessions from the West. So now we're back to square one, where everyone in Washington is critical of Erdoğan and saying we're tired of this guy. So I think right now his policies are more tilted towards Russia. Erdoğan is benefiting from the Russia sanctions. There are a lot of Russian companies set up in Turkey. After the invasion, Russian oligarchs are welcome in Turkey. So I would say it's not a balanced policy anymore between Ukraine and Russia. It's more tilted towards Russia, and American officials are constantly telling him that they don't like this. Blinken was recently in Turkey. U.S. Treasury officials are constantly saying, you know, don't do anything to compromise the sanctions regime. So again, anger and frustration in the West. Yes.
Thank you for coming back to FIU. Most of these people don't know you graduated from it.
Oh, yes.
So, PhD from our program. Let me just throw at you maybe more theory. And that is, you know, your presentation, and I have read the book, present the argument in a very focused way and the strongman and the concept that happens on the when you see this phenomenon almost everywhere, correct?
Mm.
This country that we live in lost more than 1 million people.
Yeah.
Okay? And it wasn't as good.
Mm.
It was a slow motion sickness, and nobody almost killed. Almost.
Mm.
Correct?
Yeah.
So to jump theoretically from authoritarianism to non-care and all that is a big jump.
Mm.
So when you write a book like this or a presentation, do you use political psychology as a framework of personality things? Thinking about students not to write a book.
Mm.
And you see Bolsonaro, Trump, or even after Trump.
Mm.
When something happened in 2005 in Louisiana, I saw that, you know, slow motion.
Mm.
People sitting on the roof
Mm.
for days and weeks
Mm.
and dying inside their house.
Mm.
Democracy, election, it wasn't Trump,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
It wasn't Trump. The institution of this country was completely based. Many up in Miami.
Mm.
What happened when the hurricane, when Andrew hit? I was living in Miami. People didn't come. Nobody came. Was the martial law at night? People remember. So this idea that is being there and is made of a personality like him, I think is overstretched. So I'm going to challenge you on a big conceptual
Mhm.
and also what supports this. So that's my number one. My number 2 point is that
Fundamentally, Mr. President, without the U.S. Western support, would never done this. His occupation of the part of Syria was illegal. It is supported by the Western countries. So the support from the context comes from democracies. So this idea that this has anything to do with democracy or political systems, without taking consideration that it's happening almost everywhere, different levels of its manifestation, I think theoretically it's challenging. And as a result of that, the projection of what will happen is also suspect. Why? Because he came to power not just by a coup d'etat. He came to power by a grassroots movement and shift of identity. And that's still there. Right? So my point is, what do we do theoretically and conceptually? We not just focus on one case
Yeah.
and try to make it a sort of a larger argument for political science or practical studies or IR. That was the former students like you or now lieutenant also run the think tank can give us a sort of a segue to what the students should think.
Actually, great question, and I addressed that in the book. So in the introduction, I'm trying to say that this is not actually my level of analysis is not really Erdoğan. So I'm not doing Putinology here. You know, Putin moves his leg like that. It means this. He winks, and I'm not doing that. And I actually challenged the view that was promoted by a book called Turkey's Sultan, I think. There are books and there are scholars who view Erdoğan as a sultan, as this godlike figure who just make things happen. And my book actually makes the argument that Erdoğan did not operate in an unconstrained environment. This was always a battle. Hence, the name of the book is Erdoğan's War. He was in constantly war with different actors, with the military, with the secularist judiciary, with media, with business organizations, with several different constituencies, and how he managed to win battle after battle until he won the war. So that's why my focus is not entirely on Erdoğan, but I focus on the unique socio-political case of Turkey, where I define him as a populist. And I make the argument that, as you all know, populism is this overarching thing. It's a political style, but it doesn't really offer you economic, political solutions to problems, right? So what populists do, they match their populist style with different ideologies. So when he first came to power, he matched his populism with conservative democracy, later on with Islamism, then nationalism. And what allowed him to do that, and what makes Turkish and Erdoğan's case unique, is that there has been historical cleavages in the country between the secularists and Sunni Muslim masses, between Turkish speakers and minorities, so all those historic cleavages, they allowed him to jump from one ideology to another. So it's not because he's unique. I think a combination of different factors came together at the perfect moment, including the 1999 earthquake, that brought him to power. And you're right, he did not come via coup, he won elections. But that's how literature defines autocracy. Autocracy is some autocrats come to power legitimately, but then they change the rules of the game, right? And that's what he has done. And the book tells the story of how he has done those things, and also underline the road not taken, for instance. So I'm not saying, oh, this was inevitable that he was going to become an autocrat because this is his personality. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying in very critical moments, the things that he did and the things that his opponents did came together and opened the way for him. Remind me your second question.
Yeah, that's a main point. I think the footnote to that discussion is, my point is that because this happens in so many different countries, with so many different traditions, with so many different systems, what is missing in this discussion, works on authoritarianism. Seldom they talk about the crisis of neoliberal capitalism.
Yes.
What it's actually doing to society.
Yes.
That makes fake populism or real populism possible.
Yes.
And even the largest democracy in this world going and becoming a semi-fascist state now in front of our eyes. So Turkey is not a peculiar case in a larger context of what capitalism is doing to society's access to resources. So the corruption in construction happens in Miami, happens in Brown. I mean, my point is that we need to go beyond the cases and open the larger concept of how to analyze this trend that's happening.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and the main goal of the book is to contribute to that literature as just one case. And I remember your second question, the Syria question. Actually, yes, Western countries supported what he did. Even there are journalists who are saying that CIA channeled these weapons to Syrian opposition groups. But Erdoğan was the first leader. Turkey was the first country to arm the Syrian opposition. And I think Turkey has played the most consequential outside role in the country that went way beyond Qatari weapons, what Americans did for the Syrian opposition. So that's why, because for him, again, it's a matter of domestic survival. All right, well, thank you.